Hi guys, and welcome to the Stephen King Sematary Club. This thing that I didn't like on the front is this skull. Chapter 9, Invasion of the Creepazoid. The Creepazoid in question is Frederick Clausen. That is what Liz and Thad referred to him as. And we knew that he was blackmailing them to come out with the story about Thad actually being George Stark. And he apparently did a huge amount of investigating. He made phone calls, he dug into personnel records, he had a stakeout in the town, not where Thad and Liz are, but a town nearby, where Thad would collect the George Stark checks in the mail. So this guy got photos, somehow he got a close-up of Thad holding an envelope that had the residuals or whatever from the book publisher. Alan is the one who tells them that Frederick has met his very untimely and bloody death, and they are discussing the fact that there's someone running around thinking he is George Stark. Alan also mentions that written above Frederick's body was the phrase, "The sparrows are flying again," which strikes Thad to his core because that's what he had written on that piece of paper. And after Alan leaves, Thad shows Liz the piece of paper saying, I wrote this. How is it that, the phrase that was written above the body is something that I wrote down before Alan told us? And when Liz remarks that he wrote this phrase in one of George's pencils, Thad kind of snaps at her, quote, "And they aren't George's pencils, and never were. They're mine. I'm getting goddamn tired of referring to him as a separate person. It's lost any marginal cuteness it might once have had." Page 121. So Thad is still having nightmares. We learn more about his troubles that he had, where he was drinking a lot. He was feeling like a literary failure. Liz had her miscarriage. Someone pushed her down an escalator and she lost her babies. And he kind of did a half-hearted suicide attempt. He took sleeping pills and drank a whole bunch of Jack Daniels. Thad is still having his nightmares, only now Frederick Clausen is in the nightmare dead, and George refers to dead Frederick and Liz as fool stuffing. And the description of George is just, all I can see is Dolph Lundgren. He's tall, he's blonde, he's a little tannish. He just, I don't know, I keep seeing Drago. Thad goes to the doctor to get himself checked out because Liz really wants him to, and then he goes to his office. He has another episode where he's kind of mind melding with George, and a whole bunch of things are written on this piece of paper. He doesn't know what to make of it. He ends up burning it, throws it into the incinerator, and decides to not mention it to anyone. So George is in New York, and he's singling out the people who have contributed to his ruination. The people who have killed him, he is taking revenge upon. The next murder is Miriam, and it's pretty brutal. George is hiding in her apartment, and she realizes that someone is in there at the very last second, and he ends up yanking her hand, dragging her into her own apartment. He beats her. He makes her call Thad, and as she's about to say something, he slices her cheek with his straight razor. She screams. Thad doesn't know what to do. George terrorizes her, beats her, slices her. He ends up cutting the phone conversation short by slicing through the landline, and then he slits Miriam's throat. "When it was a woman, you closed her eyes. It didn't matter how bad she had been. It didn't matter if she was a junkie whore who had sold her own kids to buy dope. You closed her eyes." Page 136. So after the whole Miriam debacle, Thad calls Alan, tells him, you have to send someone to check on this person. I can't tell you how I know, just do it. And turns out, yep, he was right, she's dead. They put protection on her ex-husband and the photographer and writer of the People article, all these people who are connected to Thad and the keeping the secret of George Stark. Those people are the ones that George Stark blames for his death, and he is exacting his revenge by killing all of them. So the next one we have is Michael Donaldson. He was the photographer, and he puts up such an impressive fight. I love this scene. George Stark is waiting for him. George steps up behind him and is ready to kill him. Well, the guy is just so resourceful or so lucky, I don't know which. And everything that George does, this guy manages to thwart him. He's bloodied, he is running, he won't die. Quote, the Mark's speed and sense of self-preservation was almost enough to outweigh the fucking nuisance he was making of himself. Page 164. So there's been this unfortunate situation where George is trying to kill him, and he keeps evading. And George either misses or hits something that's not going to actually kill the guy, and he runs down the hall and he's trying to make it to the elevator banks, and he almost gets there, and George finally kills him. The cops arrive at that very moment after he's been killed, so George hides behind a plant, and when they're distracted by the body on the floor, he sneaks into the elevator, and as the elevator door's closing, he kind of waves at them, and then he's gone. He goes to Phyllis Meyer's condos, and he kills her. She has police protection, but George Stark is pretending that he's a blind man who got attacked because he's covered in blood. He stole a cane from an actual blind man. He manages to catch the policeman off guard. He kills them, and then he moves on to Phyllis, and he pretends to be one of the cops, saying that he took care of the bad guy. So she's looking, and he shoots her through the door. Rick is next. He was Miriam's ex-husband, and he leaves to make a statement at the police precinct. When he comes back, there is an explosion because his door has been rigged by Stark to explode and kill him. So there's just all these things that are lining up, and they're all brutal. They're all impressively executed. You know, Stark really knows what he's doing. I really appreciate that George Stark is such a badass. He's so terrifying. He has no real concern for human life, and he is a machine, and he's very efficient. So he's a good killer, and he is unencumbered by morals, so he is a really dangerous and terrifying man. Liz and Thad are convinced that this is George Stark, and Alan thinks that it's someone pretending to be George Stark. He can't even begin to think about this being a character from a book who has come to life. And then this is compounded because they send technicians over to the Beaumont house to wiretap the phones. And as soon as the equipment is in place, there's a phone call. And of course it's George Stark. So he's talking to Thad, and he knows that the phones have been tapped. He's saying that he was in a mental institution, and he understands that he is not George Stark, and, you know, he did all these things, but he's basically a crazy guy. And then Thad kind of throws him for a loop when he asks about the sparrows, and George has no idea what he's talking about, and that's the only time in the conversation that he kind of gets rocked back on his heels. And then Thad goes to the grocery store and gets another phone call, because Stark knew he'd be out of the house and they could talk without an audience. And he tells Thad that he needs to write a new George Stark book, and he needs to have at least 30 pages in a week, or something bad is going to happen. Thad ends up trying to put himself into a trance to try and get into George Stark's head. And he is in his study. He's managed to make this connection, which comes in the form of sparrows who are flying outside the window and landing all around Thad's house. And he does manage to start writing about Miriam's death, and he taps into George Stark's memory or experience, something. Once Stark realizes what's happening, he gets pissed at the violation, and he takes control of Thad's hand, and he brings his hand around with the pencil and stabs the webbing between the thumb and the finger. He stabs that pencil right in there, so Thad has this huge wound from his encounter, which could have gone even worse. It could have been something fatal. In order to do that, George had to do it himself with his writing instrument. So they have like a mirrored injury, which then we find out that the twins, the William and Wendy twins, one of them falls, Wendy falls. She gets a big bruise, and then within hours, her brother develops the same bruise, same size, same shape, same color, even though he had nothing to do with this accident. He didn't hurt himself. He is getting a sympathetic bruise. So we have the twin connection with the children and the twin connection with Thad and his dark half, George Stark. George Stark is decomposing. He smells bad. He looks terrible. He's putting makeup on. It's kind of working for the moment. He can't write himself. He has realized this. He needs Thad to write for him. And he needs Thad to write in order to kind of fix him and reverse this process. Which kind of reminds me of the sped up aging process that we saw in The Hunger. And part of me wonders if Thad could have just evaded George for a couple months. He probably would have just died, and like really died, gone away. Thad goes back to his office at the university, and he meets Raleigh de Lesseps, who's kind of an old, flighty professor who kind of reminds me a little bit of Matt Burke. George calls and tells Thad that he's over his deadline and he needs to get moving on his book. Raleigh and Thad are kind of having a secret conversation because Thad has his police detail following him, and Thad is very interested in folklore and how sparrows tie into that, and he knows that Raleigh is well versed in this kind of thing, so Raleigh goes and does some investigating and comes back to talk to him. And he finds out that sparrows are psychopomps, and they are supposed to guide lost souls back to the land of the living. Then as Thad is ready to go home, he hears from George Stark again, and he learns that George is calling from inside his house. So George tells Thad that he needs to lose his police detail and get out to Castle Rock because he is abducting Liz and the kids. Have some